Okay, folks, it's time to see what the Bible has to say today. We got Starlight Baptist Church here coming to you from San Antonio. I'm Ron Buchanan, and I want to talk this morning specifically about a couple of interlaced subjects here. The primary one is Satan's hatred for the Jews. And it's a relevant thing because it's still going on today. Anti-Semitism is alive and well in the world. And there's reasons for it. And the initial reason for it goes all the way back to the first book in the Bible, Genesis, chapter 3, verse 15. After Adam and Eve had screwed up and eaten the fruit that God told them not to eat, and the wheels fell off, and God had to come down and choose Adam out, he choose Eve out, and then he choose Satan out. In the midst of that chewing out to Satan, God gives a promise to Adam and Eve and mankind as a whole, that at some future date, a redeemer will come and make things right. And of course, Satan he goes nuts on this thing, because now he's got to look over his shoulder. He's always going to have to be alert. He's always going to have to be on the defensive. And of course, the best defense is a good offense. And so he's always going to have to be looking. So he kicks into, hyper mode immediately. Okay, he's got a certain bit of information. The information that he has from God is that from the human race itself, a redeemer is going to come and make things right. Not going to be some comet from outer space. It's not going to be some force or anything like that. It's going to grow up as a mist out of the ground. It's going to come from mankind itself. So this is a big, big clue. So he immediately goes to work. And in chapter 4, the very next chapter of the Bible, we've got two boys at this point. Satan knows that the Redeemer is going to come through this family line. So one of the boys ends up dead. Cain kills Abel. And in one fell swoop, Satan has cut his losses to 50%. Well, that doesn't do the job. He got 50% of the gene pool out of the mix, but Adam and Eve are going to have more kids. Those kids are going to have kids and so forth. So it's just a little temporary win for Satan, and he realizes this. So over the next centuries, he takes a different tack. Instead of outright killing somebody, now he's going to try to pollute the gene pool. And by the time we get to Genesis chapter 6, you see how fast all this is coming? Chapter 3, we have the fall and the promise. Chapter 4, we have the first killing. Chapter 6, now we have the gene pool as a whole so corrupted and so polluted. We're down to like 99.999999999% of the population is shot as far as being able to bring forth the Redeemer. There could have been anywhere from 1.5 to 4 billion people on the earth at the time of the flood. Because these girls are popping them out just left and right. and there's not that much natural, disease and catastrophes and so forth to, keep killing everybody off. And so the population is just exploding in that time. But Satan's plan of subverting the gene pool is so successful that we are reduced to 8 people. That's it. Everybody else is compromised. Everybody else is polluted or so. Everybody else is knocked out of the game. And God kills them all. Down to 8 people. Well, Satan's probably feeling pretty good about himself at this point. I mean, the plan didn't 100% work, but boy, it was a lot better than the 50-50 with Cain and Abel. And so time goes on again. So after the big, gigantic flop of the flood and the sons of God coming in to the daughters of men, Satan has a little bit of a breather. He's down to 8 people. He can control this situation, but of course, life being what it is, they start to multiply and replenish the earth again. And so now the population starts to increase. Well, this time Satan takes a different tack. There's too many people now that he can't kill them all. He's already played his hand at trying to pollute the gene pool. So now he just sits back and he watches. And there comes a time when God singles out a specific guy and his wife, Abraham and Sarah. And to them, God makes certain promises. And the promises that he makes involve a coming Messiah. Ooh, now Satan's ears really perk up. What is this I'm hearing? Ooh, a chosen people, a chosen person. And now he can basically disregard the rest of the world as far as his attention is concerned. And now he is tunnel vision and laser focused on these 2 people, Abraham and Sarah. Ha ha, I've got it, he says. So God says to Abraham and Sarah, leave your family, leave everything, come on down and follow me into the land of milk and honey. I'll take care of you. I'll establish you. I'll fix you all up. You know the story? They get down into the land, and the first thing that happens, there is a famine in the land. And these old day famines, these are killers. This isn't just, oh, well, I have to tighten my belt for 3 weeks or so. These famines would go on for years. Transportation, we think we have a transportation problem now. Imagine you're living in 2100 BC. And that little, acreage or that little farmland that you have is not producing. And the little farmland next to it and the one next to that and so forth, nobody's producing. There's nothing to transport. And so in those days, famines were fatal. And that was the first thing that Satan did when they came into that land. Boom, famine comes up. Well, that doesn't work because God takes Abraham and Sarah, and he says, get on down to Egypt. They got grain down there. They got food there. So they say, okay. They get down into Egypt. And what's the first thing that Satan does? He goes after Sarah in the sense that she must have, at 65 years old, still been an absolute fox. Because word gets up to Pharaoh about this new strange lady that's come down with this guy. And Pharaoh puts the word out. And they take Sarah from Abraham. And they're going to put her in Pharaoh's harem. She's going to become a concubine to Pharaoh. And so God steps in and he sends Pharaoh a dream and he says, you better keep your hands off. Don't touch her. She's mine. She's sacred. Leave her alone. And so Pharaoh backs off. He doesn't want any trouble with God. And so the famine ends. They end up going back into Israel. And life goes on. So at this point, Satan is still focused on the family. Abraham and Sarah have a kid, Isaac. Isaac has a kid called Jacob. Jacob, his name is changed at some point in the narrative, and God gives him a new name, and that name is Israel. So now the family has grown. There's 12 boys who are eventually going to be known as the 12 tribes of Israel. But they're 70 people. You got the 12 boys, you got the mom and the dad, and then you got, relatives and whatnot, and hangers on, and slaves and whatnot. Not very big. They can't really defend themselves against any big power. And so God sends them down to Egypt again. And he keeps them in Egypt until, as a nation now, they are grown to the point where they can defend themselves. But unfortunately, they're still under the yoke of a new Pharaoh, because 400 years have gone by now. A guy named Moses comes along. By now, God realizes and sees that the nation of Israel, although slaves at this time in Egypt, they are big enough. If they get out from under the yoke of Pharaoh, they can handle themselves now. So here we've got 12 boys who are going to be known to the world by various names: the Hebrews, the Israelis, or the Jews. That term, the Jews. So now God's promise to Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 3 is now focused on one racial entity, and one racial entity only as far as Satan is concerned. And that is the Jews. Satan tried to get Abraham and Sarah out of the way. He couldn't do it. God sends Israel down into Egypt so they can have a breathing room, so they can now multiply, so that they can now organize themselves in a tribal situation. And they do, although be it as slaves, they are still a unit. They are still tribal. They still know, family trees and so forth. They just have to get out of there. And so God is going to use Moses to get them out. There's been several times in human history that national edicts have gone out by various governments to literally and specifically kill the Jews. It's still going on today. AntiSemitism is alive and well in 2022. It's never changed. In fact, in some parts of the world, it is ramping up. So the events that we're talking about here that happened thousands of years ago, they are still relevant today. I want to look briefly at 3 of these times in history of which national edicts were proclaimed to specifically kill the Jews. Number 1 is in Moses' time. Number 2 is under Queen Esther. And number 3 is under Jesus in his time. We know about Moses. He lived around 1500 BC. We know that when he was born, Pharaoh, because Pharaoh was now worried about the Jews because they were starting to outnumber his own people. Because the Pharaoh at that time in Egypt was not a natural born Egyptian as such. He was from Mesopotamia. A bunch of guys that come down, conquered Egypt at some point in that 400-year period of history when the Jews were down there. And they were a minority, but they conquered the country. And now the Pharaoh who sits on the throne, he is not racially as such an Egyptian. So him and his people are now worried that the Jews are starting to outpopulate them and outnumber them. And so his solution is, hey, let's kill all the baby boys that are born. And you remember that story, how that Moses' mom and dad, they illegally had him. He's born. They illegally let him live. They can only hold him or take care of him for 3 months, and then he's too loud or rambunctious or won't stop crying or something. And so they have to, make that hard decision, and they let him go. So the mom makes a little bulrush, a little ark that floats in the water. They take him down to the river. They put him in the river, and the little thing floats down. And his big sister Miriam walks down the side of the river bank, watching the little thing, and she sees somebody picks up the little baby. They hear him crying in that little ark of bulrushes. And it happens to be Pharaoh's daughter. Pharaoh's daughter said, "What's this?" "Oh, it's a little Hebrew kid. What do I do with this?" She's, probably a young girl. She doesn't know anything about kids or anything. At that point, boom, Miriam pops up, runs over. She says, "Hey, I can find a handmaid for you. I can find a nursemaid for you. I can find somebody that will take care of the kid." And Pharaoh's daughter says, "Great, go get him." And Miriam runs back to her mom, the mom of Moses, and say, "You're never going to believe what happened." And she tells her the story. And so now Moses' mom gets to take the baby and raise it. Although technically, he is now the son of Pharaoh's daughter, but on a practical basis, his own mom gets hired to raise him. An incredible thing. But the national edict had gone out, and the baby boys by the thousands or the tens of thousands were killed in that period of time. You have the person of Queen Esther. And she's roughly another 500 years after Moses. Another edict in her lifetime goes out to kill the Jews. And that gets thwarted because she's able to talk the king into allowing the Jews to arm themselves and defend themselves against those clowns who are out to kill them. You see how history doesn't really change much. The first thing that a tyrant or a dictator does when they come into a country or take over a country, the first thing they want to do is disarm the people. Take their guns away. And there's an obvious reason for that. It doesn't take a political scientist to figure out why the government wants to have the citizenry disarmed, so the citizenry cannot fight back, they cannot resist. See, like I said, these biblical things never change. Solomon said it best when he said, there is nothing new under the sun. The same junk that was going on back there 3, 4, 5,000 years ago, it's the same junk that's happening today. We might have different clothes, we might have different hairstyles, we might have different technology, but the basic premises are still the same. Dictators always want to disarm you. Dictators are always afraid of the population. So let's cull the population. Let's kill all the ones that we're worried about in the future. Certain things never change. We can look around today. What is the primary thing that the federal government is trying to do today? Disarm the people. And then the third one that I mentioned was Jesus. When Jesus was born, remember, an edict went out. Let's kill all the little baby boys, 2 years old and under. So these three incidents, Moses dealt with killing all the babies. Esther dealt with killing all the Jews in general. In Jesus' time, killing all the little baby boys again. Well, in the case of Moses, how did God get around this thing? Well, in Moses' case, he gave Moses incredible powers. You know, the 10 plagues of Egypt, number one. And that got Pharaoh's attention to the point that he gave up and he said, okay, you guys can split. He rescinded that decision. Boom, 24 hours later, he gets his army together and they're charging after the Jews to kill them out in the wilderness. And so God has Moses open up the Red Sea and they walk across. And throughout Moses' lifetime, as he's leading the children of Israel through, you know, all the miracles and stuff that he did, the striking of the rock, the water coming out, saving them from drought and starvation and so forth. It was just miracle after miracle after miracle that God allowed Moses to do to get his attention from the people. Queen Esther, well, she didn't really do any miracles as such. You know what she used? She used sex and love. She was married to King Ahasuerus. He was the king / emperor / ruler, whatever term you want, of an empire that ranged from India, which is right against China, from India all the way to Ethiopia, the entire Mideast, the entire North Africa, the entire Southern Europe, Eastern Europe. It was probably the greatest populated landmass on the planet at that time, and it was ruled by one guy. He had a queen, Vashti, and she ticked him off one day. She disrespected him, if you please. And he went apoplectic in this thing, and he said, she's out of here. And I said, well, that's, you know, his guy said, well, that's fine and dandy, but we still have to have a queen. And so Ahasuerus sends out a casting call. And that's basically what it was. From India to Ethiopia, a casting call goes out, and he says, I want you guys to find me the hottest, perfect, most beautiful virgins in the empire, and you send them to me. and I'll pick. So these virgins all come from all over the empire. They are trained, they are doted on, they are purified, they are washed up. They are washed, purified, anointed, sacrificed, just everything for a year. For a year. And at the end of that year, he picks a girl named Esther. He doesn't know, and he couldn't care less at this point, that she happens to be a Jew. And her uncle is a guy named Mordecai, and he says, don't tell the king you're a Jew. You keep that secret. Don't blab it out. Keep it to yourself. She says, okay. She doesn't have a mom or a dad. Mordecai is technically her uncle. Time goes on. And to make a long story shorter, the king ends up signing an edict at the behest of his right-hand man, a guy named Haman. Haman hates the Jews with a passion. He connives and he talks the king into signing a decree that on such and such a date, all the Jews in the empire, not the city, not the town, not the little country that he happened to live in the empire, that's from Ethiopia to China, that all Jews are fair game. Anybody who wants to kill a Jew can kill a Jew, no problem. Government's not going to say boo about it. Word gets to Esther. Esther runs to Mordecai. What do I do? Because she knows she's a Jew. She knows Mordecai is a Jew, but the king doesn't know that she's a Jew. And so Mordecai tells her what to do. He says, I want you to convince the king that he somehow has to countermand the order that he's already signed, and that's almost impossible with the Medes and the Persians and so forth, that once the king had decreed something, that was it. He couldn't go back on it. He couldn't change it or anything. But they found a way around it. And the way around it was, we are going to allow the Jews to arm themselves. So that if the local yahoos want to take on the Jews, okay, they're not just sitting there like a bunch of sheep, unable to defend themselves. They will have the ability to arm themselves and defend themselves. And that's what happened. The day came, and the bad guys say, oh boy, it's Jew killing time today. Let's go for it. And they run into a buzzsaw. The Jews kicked their butts. They didn't know what hit them. And so at the end of the day, boom, that was it. Game over. Satan lost again. He can't win for losing here. And so we get down to Jesus. Time, another, 500 years later, Jesus is born. You remember the story how the three wise men came, they followed the star. The wise men started their journey from Mesopotamia to Israel. And it took them, a good year and a half or so to get there. Maybe the star didn't move that much, or maybe they had to stop for provisions, or they, just the weather or something. But it took them a long time to get there. Because when they get there, they don't see a baby in the manger. That was the shepherds the night that Jesus was born. By the time the wise men get there, it says that Jesus is a young child and he's living in a house. So we know that a year and a half or so had gone by from when the three wise men first saw the star in the east. That was the night that Jesus was born. They started their journey, and by the time they got there, Jesus is now a little boy living in a house. You remember when they came, they gave him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Okay. One night, God comes to Joseph and he says to Joseph, I want you to get up. It's the middle of the night. I want you to get up. I want you to take the young child, take his mom, and I want you to split down to Egypt. Well, now this isn't an easy thing. We kind of think that, well, in those days, all they had to do was, jump on the donkey or the camel or the burro or the mule or whatever, and just take off and split. Things were the same in those days. You had to have provisions. You had to feed the animal along the way. That cost money. You had to have inns and lodgings and places to stop and rest in the evening. That cost money. You had to pay for food. You might even have to pay for protection sometimes in various spots. In other words, it took a lot of money to get from point A to point B. Once they got to Egypt, now they've got all the living expenses, because Joseph just can't come in and just, start up his carpenter shop as such. It takes money to get that thing going, to get the resources, to rent the space or buy the space or whatever, the materials and so forth. So there's a lot of money involved in this thing. I said, well, gee whiz. Wonder how they got the money. You think that God doesn't look forward in the spyglass of time? When those three wise men came, they had gold, they had frankincense, they had myrrh. The frankincense and the myrrh are spices, and those spices were worth more than their weight in gold. So when those three guys left that little kid in the house with those gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, Joseph and Mary were incredibly rich at that point. So now God comes along, pick up the child, boom, split to Egypt. No harm, no foul, no problem. They've got the money, they've got the resources. They can spend their whatever time they had to spend in Egypt until Herod was dead and it was safe to come back. Now they've got the whole trip of having to come back. And it wasn't just to Bethlehem. Bethlehem was a suburb of Jerusalem, 1.5, 2 miles out. Now they have to go all the way up to Nazareth, which is in northern Israel. So the whole thing was a ton of money. And then once they get to Nazareth, now Joseph once again has to start up his carpenter business. He has to, wait for the revenues to start coming in. Everything was covered with that gold, frankincense, and myrrh. God will never, ever ask you to do something, regardless of how bad it seems, that he doesn't provide you with the resources to do it. You might not recognize it. You might not see it. But God's there to give it. Well, poor old Satan, I say that laughingly. He screwed up every step of the way here. He can't get a break. He thinks he has Jesus nailed when he gets nailed to the cross. That is his ultimate triumphant moment. Jesus preaches for 3.5 years or so. At the end of that time, Satan has instigated the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes and some of the just regular people, even one of his disciples, to the point that they're ready to sell him out. They're ready to have him killed. They're ready to be done with him. Things are looking good for Mr. Satan at this point. Jesus goes to the cross. He hangs there for 6 hours. At the end of that 6 hours, he dies. Satan is on top of the world. The promise of Genesis chapter 3, verse 15 is gone. It's out, it's null, it's void. I have won. Oops. 3 days later, somebody rises from the dead. There's a stone rolled over the mouth of that tomb. There are Roman centurions guarding the tomb. And yet, Jesus rises from the dead. And Satan's world just collapses. Now the hatred that was born in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, and initially instigated on Abel, and then the world as a whole, basically, when the sons of God came in under the daughters of men in Genesis chapter 6, and he obliterates the entire planet down to 8 people. And then his hatred is focused on a couple, Abraham and Sarah. That all fumbles and follows through and everything. And then he tries with Moses, and then he tries with Esther, and then he tries when Jesus was a little baby to have all the little kids killed, all the little baby boys. He finally gets the big prize, Jesus on the cross, and now Jesus is risen from the dead, and now he is just apoplectic with rage. But now his rage, he can't go after Jesus anymore. Jesus is way above his pay grade at this point. He's not talking to man out in the wilderness when Jesus has gone 40 days and 40 nights and he was hungry and thirsty and tired and emotionally beat down and so forth. No. Now Jesus is the risen Savior. He is back to his original position as God of this world, of this universe, creator, sustainer of this universe. He's the one that's juggling all the atoms. He's the one that's keeping all the molecules in place and everything. It's Jesus. So he is way out of touch now from Satan. But Satan still has this rage. And so who does he focus it on? The Jews. He can't get the Jew, Jesus, but he's going to get the family. He's going to get that race. He's going to go after them with a blind hatred. So for 2,000 years, since the resurrection of Jesus, through now, anti-Semitism has run rampant in this world. Nation after nation after nation have instituted programs whereby either, the Jews are fair game, kill whoever you want, no problem, no harm, no foul. The Jews have gone through periods of time in major countries where all their assets are confiscated by the government. They've been booted out. They've been subjected to this for 2,000 years. You realize that the Crusades were technically, set up by the Catholic Church to free the Holy Land from the Arabs. In the Crusades lasted for like 300 years. There were like 12 different Crusades in this period. It wasn't just one big battle type thing in one little era. This stretched for 3 centuries. 12 different Crusades. You realize that more Jews were killed by the Crusaders than Arabs were killed by the Crusaders? Every town, every country that the Crusaders would go through on their way from Europe to the Holy Land, every time they come across a Jew, they would kill the Jews. wasn't just the Arabs they were going for. They were killing the Jews too, because it was the Jews who killed Jesus. They weren't trying to save the Holy Land for the Jew. They were trying to save it for themselves, the Catholic Church. So more Jews were killed in the Crusades than there were Arabs killed. The Spanish Inquisition, for instance, you know who started that? Good old Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand. Yes, that Isabella and Ferdinand of 1492, when they sent Columbus off and the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria and discovered the New World, those two, Ferdinand and Isabella, they started what would later become known to the world as the Spanish Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition theoretically was trying to wipe out heresy that had crept into the church. They wanted to purify the church. When we say church, we're talking the Catholic Church here. It was primarily set up to get rid of the Jewish influence, the Jewish money, and the Jewish intellectuals. Spanish Inquisition was not to get rid of the heresy in the church, it was to get rid of the Jews. And that was the excuse that they used. The Holocaust. Hitler comes along, he takes out 6 million Jews. You realize in the world today, there's only around 15 million Jews. Half of them, roughly, are in America here. The other half are basically in Israel. And there's a few others, scattered here and there, a bunch in Russia. But for the most part, there's only roughly 15 million Jews. That is less than 2% of the population of this world. Less than 2%. And yet look how the world fixates on these people even today. 2022. They are obsessed with it. It's an incredible thing. And it all goes back to Genesis chapter 3:15. Now, let me finish with this. These 3 people that we had mentioned and kind of focused on today. Moses, Esther, and Joseph. Do you realize that all 3 of these were stepkids? Moses was technically the stepson of Pharaoh's daughter. Esther was the stepdaughter of Mordecai. Although technically he was her uncle, he stepped in because she didn't have a mom and a dad. They had died. He stepped in as her stepdad. Joseph was technically the stepdad of Jesus. I'm talking to people today who are either stepkids themselves, or I'm talking to some parents who are step-parents. I'm a step-parent. I've got, 4 bio kids. I've got 2 stepkids that I consider just as valid, just as loving, just as much mine as my bio kids. I know that for some stepkids, that in this world today, that can be a burden for some kids. Kids at school find out, oh, you don't have a mom and a dad. You're a stepkid. You were adopted. Wear that with a badge of honor. Because God loved you to the extent that he put somebody in your life that didn't have to take you, didn't have to sign up and commit to that responsibility. of not just providing for you and paying for you and taking care of you, but the emotional responsibility that goes along with being a step parent. So if people are making fun of you because you're a step kid or you're adopted, you wear that with a badge of honor, because Jesus himself was a step kid in that respect. He had Joseph as his dad, if you please. So you're in good company. Don't feel embarrassed. Don't feel like a second-class citizen. You thank God that God put somebody in your life that would go that far because they loved you. I was going to say, I don't know what's going to happen. No, I do know what's going to happen. I've read the end of the book. The Jews are going to be exposed to a period of time, the likes of which they had never seen before. They are going to go through a 3-year period referred to in the Bible as the Great Tribulation. And in that tribulation period, those 15 million Jews that are in the world today, that's going to get whittled down to, I don't know, to 8 again? 2? I don't know how many Jews are going to be left at the end of that tribulation period, but they are going to be killed by the millions. Anti-Semitism. When you see it in the world today, when you see governments proclaiming certain laws or restrictions or prohibitions about the Jews, this goes back to Genesis chapter 3. When you see the skinheads and the white supremacists and the gangbangers and all that stuff burning Jewish synagogues or painting swastikas on the Jewish synagogues or in the cemeteries, that goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 3:15. There is nothing new under the sun. And I guess my whole point in all this historical mumbo jumbo that you've had to sit through and endure today is for this one thing and one thing only. And that is, this book is relevant. I don't care what year parts of it were written. I don't care what year the characters in this thing lived. It is still relevant to you and I today, to the extent that it is still the events going on here that started in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. Those events are being played out today like never before. The world just can't let it go. You know why? Because Satan just can't let it go. He hates them with a blind passion, and he is powerless to get out of that loop. And God's just going to suck him in and spit him out. Heavenly Father, to me, it is incredible how relevant this book has always been ever since Moses penned that first line, "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth." It is so relevant that our lives are still being dictated by the precepts put down in this book. Jerusalem is still in the headlines every day. The Jews are in the headlines every day. Nations conduct foreign policy based on their feelings and prejudices about the Jews. Oh, we're going to boycott Israel. Oh, we're not going to buy their fruit. Oh, we're not going to let them have tourist access. We're not going to blah, blah, blah. Satan can't let it go. And it just reinforces in me, Father, that your word is just as valid as it was from day one, as it is today. Even more so in the sense that we're coming to the conclusion. Any idiot can read the end of the book. They can see what's going to happen. It is being played out in front of our eyes as we speak this morning. Everything that you have said up to this point has come true. Why wouldn't we assume that the things that you say are still to come aren't going to come true? They are, and they will. God, give us a brain that we can see these things, that we can take notice of them, that we can change our lives to fit this book, not trying to make this book fit our lives or make you as a genie. Oh, what can you do for me today? We ought to start each and every day, Father, on our face before you, saying, Lord, what wilt thou have me to do? And I'm talking to Christians right now. The world's going to do what it's going to do. Satan's got his plan. He's stuck in his little rhythm, and he's just going to do what he's going to do. But Lord, your people, we've got to wake up. We've got some Christians who don't like Jews because they killed Jesus. Well, good grief. Father, give us the sense to prioritize, to give us the sense to wake up, to realize that there is more in this book than just the John 3:16 stuff. There is more to this Christian life than what you can do for us. How can you make us wealthy? How can you make us healthy? How can you make us fulfilled? How can we be the best that we can be? Phooey. Lord, what wilt thou have me to do? In the case of Paul, it was simple. He's a chosen vessel. I'll show him what great things he must suffer. We don't pray that prayer, do we, Lord? We don't want that philosophy. No. What have you done for me lately? So, Lord, swift kick in the butt, whoop upside the head, whatever it takes to get our attention. Father, we need it. And I ask for it. And I'll stand in line and take the first hit. In Jesus' name.